President Trump's nominee to lead an important government statistics agency is a Heritage Foundation economist who only last week called for suspending the monthly jobs report. Who is EJ Antoni? Can he win Senate confirmation? And what signals are in the new inflation report about the economy?
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnists Alicia Finley and Joe Sternberg. After an ugly jobs report recently, President Trump fired the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, claiming, without really pointing to any evidence, that the agency had rigged the numbers to make him look bad. On Monday, the president named his choice of replacement, EJ Antoni, the chief economist at the Heritage Foundation, who has a record as a defender of the Trump administration's policies and a brawler on social media. Here is Antoni shortly after Trump's April Liberation Day tariff announcement, defending the idea on the Tony Kinnett cast.
I really do actually like the president's strategy here. I like the idea of reciprocal tariffs. In other words, if you're going to put trade barriers in place for our exporters, if you're not going to give us access to your consumer markets, then we're going to turn around and do the same thing to you. And the reason that's such a good strategy right now for the U.S. is that so many of these countries need access to our consumer markets much more than we need access to theirs. In other words, although there's no winners in a trade war, they'll lose much more than we will. And that's why, frankly, President Trump has already had a lot of success in these negotiations. Even before the April 2nd announcement, he already had a lot of countries that were essentially coming to him and saying, look, we'll do whatever you want. Just please hold off on these tariffs.
Alicia, what do you make of this choice of Antoni, somebody who has been in the public arena making political, sometimes I think partisan arguments for the president's policies, as the choice to head this, what is normally thought of as a quiet, sleepy, technocratic agency whose job is not to defend the administration's policies, whatever that administration might be, but to get the numbers right?
Right. So the Post, the Bureau of Labor Statistics Commissioner, has usually been a nonpartisan position, meaning that it's generally been confirmed by large numbers of both parties. The previous commissioner, Erika McEntarfer, was confirmed 86-8 with broad Republican backing back in 2004. And by the way, that included J.D. Vance, other previous commissioners, Bill Beach under Donald Trump, and Erica Goshen, who served also under Trump and some of Obama. Again, broad backings. But this kind of breaks, his recent nominee of EJ Antoni kind of breaks from that mold in that he's not just a conservative who has a point of view, and you could say that about some of the other economists or statisticians who held that position. He's really more of an activist. And you can tell that just by listening to that podcast that we heard, as well as reading some things that he's written. He definitely has an ideological point of view. And in the past, in my opinion, he's slanted some data and statistics to promote his preferred and a right-wing narrative. He's a cheerleader for Donald Trump's policies, and no doubt Donald Trump likes that. But I think it does create a risk that some of the data won't be trusted by the investors, markets, and the public, which does do the agency damage.
One notable news story in the wake of the nomination was an interview that Antoni did with Fox News Digital last week on August 4th, before this nomination. Here is part of what he said, jumping off on criticisms of the BLS's reports. Quote, how on earth are businesses supposed to plan, or how is the Fed supposed to conduct monetary policy when they don't know how many jobs are being added or lost in our economy? It's a serious problem that needs to be fixed immediately. Until it is corrected, the BLS should suspend issuing the monthly jobs reports, but keep publishing the more accurate, though less timely, quarterly data, unquote. Here is White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt responding to that idea on Tuesday at the press briefing.
Look, what I'll tell you about the Bureau of Labor Statistics, I believe that is the plan and that's the hope, and that these monthly reports will be data that the American people can trust. As you know, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has made massive revisions after the last several reports that they have put out. And there has certainly been a decline in the quality and the reliability of data coming from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and there's been an increase in revisions. And this president and the administration is finally tackling this problem that so many have talked about, and the president is actually doing something about it. We need to restore new leadership that we can trust. As you know, the president has appointed someone new to take over the BLS, and so we need to look at the means and the methods of how the United States is acquiring this very important data, and all of that is going to be done, and the goal, of course, is to provide honest and good data for the American people to make very important economic decisions on.
Joe, some of the reasons that this data is noisy sometimes is that it's based on surveys of employers, of households. Survey response rates have been going down. And so it is kind of a technocratic statistics problem of how do you get the best data? Are there better ways of doing it? Is there more funding that the BLS needs to do it? But it is kind of extraordinary now that we are at a moment where we're talking about, is the BLS simply going to discontinue, to suspend the monthly reporting on how many jobs are being created or lost by the U.S. economy?
Although, look, this is one of those situations that we encounter so often in the Trump era where everyone is a little bit right and everyone is a lot wrong. And, it becomes really difficult to figure out how much of this debate is actual signal and, where all of the noise is. So here's what I think is a lot of the noise that's going on that's worth cutting through here. I don't actually think that these data are all that important to the business world because companies have access to much more granular data about what is going on in their communities with their customers, in their industries than you get from this aggregate government data that everyone has known for a long time is subject to all of these survey faults. In fact, one of the ironies of the situation is that if we are saying that the problem is that businesses are not responding to these BLS surveys about employment or anything else in a timely manner, the businesses have this information already. It's just that they haven't shared it with the government. So I think that the real people who lose out from bad BLS data are those of us in the media who are trying to develop a big picture sense of what is happening in a very complicated economy, get these monthly snapshots. I think that policymakers suffer a little bit for not getting accurate feedback from the data about what effect their policies might be having. And I do think that there is something to this complaint that the Federal Reserve in particular doesn't get good jobs data. And the Fed is aware of this, which is one reason that they increasingly focus on the quarterly data about the labor market that are somewhat higher quality than these monthly reports. But remember, the angst about this is related to the fact that the Fed is trying to use these data to very precisely fine-tune the economy. And so if we weren't trying to manage the economy in that way, the quality of the BLS data wouldn't necessarily matter to the Fed either. So I do think that this raises all sorts of interesting questions about the quality of the data that the government collects about the economy. But it also needs to be raising some questions about the uses to which the rest of us put that data. And have we fallen into the pattern of relying too heavily on particular government statistics or data points to make decisions about how we're going to try to manage the economy or our own businesses? When, remember, until approximately 1880, no one collected any of this data on the US economy, and we all managed to muddle through.
Alicia, what are some of the ways that the BLS could go about actually improving the statistics that it releases? And do you have a sense of what Antoni's beliefs on that are? Or are we waiting to see what he tells the Senate in his confirmation hearings about what his actual plans for the agency would be?
Well, I think that is the $1 trillion the lack of reliability of the statistics, and he suggested in kind of vague, broad terms that the collection methods need to be improved. And of course they do. I think that there's no doubt about that. The American Statistical Association put out a report last month that was had some input from previous BLS commissioners about things that could be done to improve them. And that includes upgrading some IT systems, moving to more online-based surveys, using AI. Incredibly, a lot of the surveys, especially of individuals, are still conducted by individuals from the BLS calling the respondents. So there are 60,000 people in the household survey, and those are being called by BLS commissioners. And there's a big issue now with more retirements, people leaving the BLS, that there aren't enough people there to actually do all these surveys. It's the same thing for the CPI price levels. You actually have people going out in these communities and looking at what things cost. The business surveys, some of this actually, the bigger businesses actually have ways to feed the information and their data directly to the BLS, but some of the smaller businesses don't and actually send it by fax. So there's a lot of technological upgrades that can be done. There's some more data sharing between agencies. There are more than a dozen statistical agencies, the Bureau of Economic Analysis within the Commerce Department, the Census Bureau, which actually helps collect some of this data with the BLS for some of the surveys. But they kind of operate in silos, and there are a lot of actually legal, regulatory reasons they can't share information. And this has prevented them from developing more accurate techniques and models. And I will underline that all these agencies rely heavily on models because you can't exactly, when you have a sample, you have to try to balance out the weights and account for various variables and potential biases in the data. So, just better sharing of information can help you develop better models. It's not clear that E.J. Antoni has considered or thought about any of this. And I think that that's an issue, and it deserves to be probed by senators in the confirmation hearing. The unfortunate reality is I don't think it will. I think this will end up being kind of a bit of a show trial for Democrats. They're going to just hammer him saying you're Donald Trump's, troll. And the Republicans are probably going to end up defending him because, well, as a reflexive or political reactionary tendency to do so.
Joe, I take your point about over-reliance on this kind of data that comes out of the government, but there are costs too if the economy becomes more opaque. If there is an erosion of trust in the statistics that are coming out of the government. I mean, China is a place where you are always looking at the statistics on the economy, and a lot of those statistics, my impression is, are fudged, or that's the read of people who are outside of China because it's a political matter for the state in that place. And to be clear, I don't think we are there yet. I think there are still a ton of hardworking people at the BLS who would work under any director in good faith. But it is interesting. I mean, the BLS also is responsible for the Consumer Price Index report. And if President Biden had fired the head of the BLS during the inflation surge and said that the inflation numbers were rigged and then put his own partisan guy in there, I can imagine there would be some Republicans who would be pretty upset about that.
Yeah, look, I mean, the data can definitely be useful. I think that high quality government statistics can be helpful as a way for politicians and businesses and media and policymakers to benchmark how they're doing on a month-to-month or a quarter-by-quarter basis, as we are constantly tinkering with government economic policy and tracking developments in the broader economy. So don't get me wrong. I mean, the numbers can be very useful in that regard. But I think there's an important sense in which what we're talking about here is really only how surprised are we all going to be at the next election. Because households know what is happening to their personal economy. right? You sit around your kitchen table, you know whether you feel like your community is in a pretty good position, whether your company is doing well, whether you're confident that your job is going to be there for you in 6 months. You also know when you sit around the kitchen table what is happening to the prices of the particular items that your family buys every week. Because remember, I mean, one of the issues that you run into with any government statistics are that we are talking about models and averages and assumptions about what typical is for the economy in an economy where there is no such thing as typical. So even if we're saying that the inflation rate is 2.7%, which was the latest data that came out this week, everyone's experience of inflation is going to be a little bit different depending on the specific goods that they get and so that they buy. And so the point is that voters will tell you at the next election what they think is going on in the economy. And you're going to have to listen to that data point, whether you want to or not. So I think that oftentimes what we're talking about when we do cover these economic statistics, or when politicians look at them, or when other people are trying to reach judgments about them, I think that there's a sense in which what you are trying to understand is what is the experience of the ordinary household or the ordinary business in America, and how is that going to feed into the political system the next time people go to the ballot box. So I think that one consequence of low quality data, which is something that we have to worry about with such a politicized pick to run the Bureau of Labor Statistics, it means that politicians and policymakers will not be getting good high interval, high frequency feedback about the consequences of their policies. And it's also going to mean that we will get more surprises when election time rolls around and all of the fog of statistics of various qualities clear away and the voters tell us what is actually happening to them.
Alicia, your sense, though, is that Antoni is probably unlikely to face a serious roadblock in the Senate to his confirmation to this post on a permanent basis. I mean, I suppose it depends on what he says in his hearing when he shows up for that, though part of the dynamic here that is also difficult to gauge sometimes is how much people in the MAGA circles are going on podcasts and playing a professional wrestling performer. And then when they show up to Senate confirmation, they present as serious, thoughtful people. I mean, Emil Bovee, the top DOJ official who was recently confirmed to a lifetime appointment or for a federal judgeship, he was kind of a brawler in the DOJ, former personal attorney to President Trump. But when he showed up to the Senate hearing, he was calm. He was straightforward. He said, I'm a textualist. This is how I'm going to interpret the law. FBI Director Kash Patel might be another example. He had a long record of going on podcasts and fanning theories about Jeffrey Epstein. And now he's actually in the job, doing the job, saying, listen, there is no cover up. And so that is part of the dynamic that is always hard to figure out, too, is when some of these figures are, play acting for political theater and when they're trying to be serious.
Well, I think that those are very good points. It is hard to tell right now. I do think that there could be some questions raised by Tom Tillis and Susan Collins, but I don't think there's going to be 4 Republicans who get together and decide to block his nomination. There's not enough in his record to raise concerns. Now, as I mentioned earlier, he has a record of being partisan writings. In an editorial, we pointed out that just last week he cited some BLS statistics, ironically, because he claims this is the data is unreliable, but he cited the BLS household survey to claim that Donald Trump's immigration policies are leading to a surge in employment among native-born Americans as more immigrants and foreign workers are removed from the economy. Now, if you actually look at the data, it raises a lot of questions because you have to look at this, how the Bureau of Labor Statistics and Census Bureau collect also the population data, which shows that this the actual population among native-born Americans has all increased by about 4.5 million in just a little over 6 months. And that seems pretty implausible given it increased about 1.5 million in the previous decade, and the basically flatlined over the previous 2 years, and that has to do with declining fertility rates, increasing deaths among older people. So that would suggest that there's some kind of survey response bias with immigrants, are maybe saying that they're native born because they're afraid of deportation. I mentioned all this because it just illustrates that maybe Antoni isn't really, I don't want to say he's not a deep thinker, but he looks at the data with kind of a partisan lens and wants to use it to promote his preferred or Donald Trump's preferred narrative. Now, will he do that as the BLS commissioner? If you look at the BLS reports, they're pretty staid. They underline this is a significant job increase, or they don't really get into any kind of political or partisan framing of data. They just said this is basically what the data show, without kind of providing any kind of context or anything. And I think that the question is, if he is confirmed, will he change that? Will he now start to trumpet in the BLS reports lower inflation among certain goods because of Donald Trump's policies, or will he try to kind of put a political lens on the data?
Let's save a few breaths for that recent inflation data. The Labor Department out on Tuesday saying that consumer prices were up 2.7% in July over the past 12 months. Core inflation, 3.1%. Core inflation, as a reminder, is without food and energy. Those are volatile categories. So economists look at core inflation because sometimes it provides a better sense of the overall general inflation trend. Joe, what is your read of this? And do we still have a Federal Reserve stuck between a rock and a hard place with President Trump calling almost daily, it seems like now, to lower rates?
Well, I think that from the Fed's perspective, this inflation report probably looks like a gift, which might be surprising to ordinary Americans who have to pay these higher prices that have gone up by 2.7% over the past year, and 3.1% on core inflation, which is otherwise known as inflation on all of the things that households buy other than, food and gas. So it's sort of an artificial distinction there in some ways. But I think that the consequence for the Fed, and one of the reasons that financial markets reacted so enthusiastically to this news, is that the data were not worse, because I think that a bunch of economists on Wall Street had thought that we might come in the neighborhood of 2.8%. So the fact that a 2.7% increase is all we got. I know, I'm sure everyone who's listening to this is out there throwing a ticker tape parade now. It offers the Fed the escape hatch that they wanted in order to cut interest rates, because I think the Fed has wanted to cut rates for a while. In fact, they started last autumn, and then they realized that they had probably jumped the gun a little bit at that point. But clearly, there has been mounting anxiety about the state of the economy on the Federal Open Market Committee, a desire to cut rates. Funnily enough, they've probably held off from doing that, partly because they didn't want to cut when the inflation still seemed to be elevated and they were so far off of their 2% target. Partly it's also because of the pressure from President Trump to cut rates. The Fed did not want to look like it was giving into that kind of political pressure. So, Kyle, you asked whether the Fed might be stuck between a rock and a hard place here. I think that it may end up being the case that the Fed will think that they have finally found their path out of that dilemma. And is that good for the economy? Probably not. I think that anyone who is still seeing prices going up at the supermarket or the Walmart, especially as we're getting into back to school season, might have other opinions about that. But I think from the Fed's perspective, this does them a favor by giving the excuse that they have desperately been hoping for to start doing some of these rate cuts as we get into September and beyond.
Alicia will give you the last word, but anything that you would want to pick out of this CPI inflation report from Tuesday?
Well, I think it's notable that the service index is continuing to increase, even as the shelter has come down. And that's in large part because the medical services are increasing in price now. I would say that this is kind of a microeconomic point, but that's because you have a lot of hospitals and now finally passing on their cost increases that they've been experiencing in terms of labor and such. Over the last few years to insurers, in the way it's kind of a technical way that the BLS calculates inflation for these particular indexes, but it's really the hospital and medical services are a bigger component than insurance prices, even though we pay more for insurance than for hospitals out of pocket. So I think that shows that there's actually kind of a lag effect of easier monetary policy earlier on that's now kind of starting to filter through into the economy. You also see an increase in auto repair services, and that may actually be a product of both increasing labor costs, but also higher costs for the auto repair shops are having to pay more for auto parts as a result of tariffs. So I think that there's a lot of still uncertainty. I think inflation is still proving pretty sticky. And in my view, I think there's no reason for the Fed to cut at this rate, at this point.
Thank you, Alicia and Joe. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.